Hello, hello. Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us for African History Month. We have some very special guests today. Thank you, and you better stay tuned. All right, as stated, we are here live. Thank you so much for joining us for African History Month. Today, we have some of the greatest minds in the mental health field discussing a very important, very relational topic of intergenerational trauma. And on my panel here today, we're going to start by having everyone go ahead and introduce themselves. So if you could just start by telling us your name, where you currently work out of, your location, and what it is that you currently do. We can go ahead and start with you, Miss Carla. Oh, I think you may be muted.
Okay, I failed that first test. Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Carlisle. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I am a trauma expert and child advocate. And is there anything else you wanted me to add there?
No, that's great.
Okay.
That's great.
Awesome.
And where are you practicing out of right now?
Out of Charlotte, North Carolina.
Perfect. All right, Miss King, go right ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and just an honor to be here. My name is Dr. Jacqueline King. I am in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I am a mental health advocate, formerly served on the National Alliance of Mental Illness board in Greensboro, North Carolina. I've done a lot of programs in Greensboro around mental health. We did a 5-part series for the city of Greensboro, and also my nonprofit supports women and men with mental health issues. So it's an honor to be here.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Stevens, go ahead.
Hi, I am Charlotte Stevens and the Ancestors. I am out of San Jose, California. So hello, beautiful people. Good morning, beautiful people. I do anti-racism work in the schools to protect the psychological safety of Black children and the mental health of Black children. I am also the world's greatest personal growth accelerator for badass Black women who want to goddess up. And that is about protecting the mental health of Black women, teaching them about their Black girl magic, and helping them to start their own businesses so they don't have to be in toxic white spaces that are constantly affecting their mental health. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. And last but certainly not least.
So anything that we talk about, right, there you go. Anything that I talk about will only be diminished by that particular conversation presented by the ancestors. It is a pleasure to be here with Dr. King and Dr. Carlisle to talk about this idea of trauma. We advance the concept of trauma not being something that is something that you can look at from a European perspective. Thus, we do not have anything called post When we talk about people of African descent, it is ongoing. Straker talks about continuous. We call it persistent and stable systemic trauma that goes on. So my name is Dr. Kevin Washington, also Mwata Kairi, and the work that we do is looking at the dynamics of trauma within the context of African people. So we talk about African spirit disruptions. We talk about also the healing process of such. And so we practice with license in Washington, D.C. and in Florida. But I'm also the chair of the psychology department at Grambling State University. So I'll just pause it right there for now.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. And hi, good morning, Zoe. Thank you for joining us. So we're just doing quick introductions right now. If you can just tell us your name, what it is you do, and where you're practicing from.
Hi, good morning. Pleasure to be here. My name is Zoe Mead. I'm currently in San Antonio, Texas. I work I work in legal for the federal government at the moment, but I do have a background educationally in mental health.
Awesome. So I told you guys that we had a panel full of great minds. And as you can see, that has proved to be true after their introductions. And as we just gauge into intergenerational trauma, I want to just kind of ask the panel, and you can feel free to pick one or more of the spaces that you currently represent. What does intergenerational trauma mean to you? How would you define that? If you can sum it up in a sentence or two, what does intergenerational trauma mean to you? And we'll just go ahead and go in that same order if that's okay with everyone. Sorry, Carla.
Okay, I'm going to be the first guinea pig here. So, to me, intergenerational trauma has more than one meaning, but I'll speak about it personally. I became a foster parent to a 10-day-old baby boy who was the 11th child of his birth mother. And she had lost her parental rights to the other 10. And what I found through engaging with his birth mother was that as a child, she experienced extensive trauma. And as we talked more about her family and I learned more about the family, her mother experienced extensive trauma. And so that engagement with my son's birth family was really my first eye-opening exposure to intergenerational trauma. And so while I believe that history plays a huge role in it, from a day-to-day experience, what I would say is when we have unresolved trauma or trauma that hasn't been processed and we aren't supported or get help, especially as children, it can just be perpetuated from one generation to the next. There's a lot of historical context there, but as I look at, an immediate family, that's what comes to mind when I think of intergenerational trauma.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Dr. King, when you think about intergenerational trauma, what does that mean to you?
Absolutely. So intergenerational trauma refers to trauma that is passed from trauma to survivor to their descendants. And it can also be referred to as transgenerational or multi-generational trauma. So it's like Dr. Carla said, the same thing. So if you're experiencing, and even in a pregnancy, if you're experiencing trauma, you can actually pass it on to your children, not just by them seeing it or living it, but that trauma actually can affect them for the rest of their lives unless they get professional help. So that is what I think intergenerational trauma is.
Wow. Charlotte Stevens and the Ancestors, when you think about intergenerational trauma, what does that mean to you?
So I think about that in terms of how the women I coach, how it impacts them. So for example, a lot of Black women or Black people in general have a really hard time resting, have a really hard time relaxing, taking time for themselves, celebrating themselves. And so I link that back to enslavement, where resting meant severe punishment for us, right? There was no opportunity to rest. So I feel like that's part of what stands in the way of Black women being able to do real self-care, is that feeling of I have to keep working or I'll die. It's like subconscious, but I have to keep working or I'll die. So I see it there. I see it with my Black women who feel like they're an imposter. Like just like what we saw with the Supreme Court Justice Brown, who's being sworn in. She had more experience than everybody. That's typically what it is with Black women. We're typically more experienced, but we still feel like we're not capable. And so I feel like that's generational trauma. Trauma around speaking out and standing out, especially for Black women. I feel like somebody called it the witch wound, that we were persecuted historically for standing out, and that there's still that fear that if I stand out, I speak out, they're going to come for me. Our sexuality as Black women, we haven't really been able to embrace it. We've been sexualized, we've been abused, and so it's hard for us to be in that space where we can own our sexuality because we haven't been protected. And then the trauma in school. So I see it with parents who feel like they were affected by the traumatic experiences they had in school. So it's hard for them to then advocate for their kids or go to the school because the schools are a source of trauma as well. So I see it across the board. Yeah. So thank you for letting me speak on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Zoe, how about you? When you generally think of intergenerational trauma, what does that mean to you?
I agree with Charlotte Stevens and the ancestors that it's multifaceted and it comes across in several different aspects of everyday life. And I think a lot of times, if you're not acutely aware of it, it can actually just seem like something that's normal, just something that naturally occurs because it's been happening for so long. And so I do agree with that. Personally, I think that one of the places that I've personally felt it the most was in finances.
Mm.
I think that that's something that's been really difficult for me to kind of break away from and understand that it is something that I can break away from and, set things up for not only me, but the people around me in my close circle who may also not be realizing that this is actually a trauma that they're going through.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Doctor, tell us what you think about when you think of
So
intergenerational trauma.
it was amazing, right? So when Dr. King mentioned transgenerational trauma, it's important to know that the language is there, and she alluded to epigenesis, the idea that Diaz and Reza did research that showed us that mice have the capacity to transmit the trauma response to their pups, because they had this research done where they had the mouse with the cherry blossom smell, and then the shock or the traumatic experience. They associated the smell of cherry blossoms with the particular shock, and then they would have pups, and these pups would also have this response to the cherry blossom smell, though they had never been shocked. And these pups would also have pups, and they would have the same response to the smell, the odor, but not have had the trauma or the shock. So it indicates that we can pass down that. And so what Dr. Carlisle mentioned about the experience of the child that she adopted, we talked then about trauma not only in the context of the immediate family, but also as Stevens mentioned, we have the generational discourse of trauma that's passed down genetically that actually weakens the package, because our trauma responses is based on what we have, what we're born with, as well as what we strengthened by in our environment. And so we know then that we understand the 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 neurotransmitters and so forth. We actually have a weakened then capacity to address trauma, which leads to
Wow.
other dynamics of ill health. And so this is a heavy conversation that we're having today. So when we talk about transgenerational trauma, I think about not only what's happening to us right now in the immediate situation of traumatization, of being dehumanized and demarginalized, but also what has happened to us historically as a people, as a collective, cultural trauma. And that is why we talk about trauma-informed care within the cultural context.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. All of you kind of hinted to this, and I guess you can't really talk about intergenerational trauma without talking about ways or how to break it, right? So now that we've all kind of talked about what it means to us, and I'm sure the people that are listening or watching have their own versions of how intergenerational trauma has shown up. I have a question for the panel. Whose job is it to begin to break those intergenerational traumas? Whose job is it to begin the healing? Is it our parents? Was it our parents? Is it ours? Is it our children's? Whose job is it, and how do you I guess delegate the job, whose job it is to start breaking some of that intergenerational trauma? Dr. Carlisle, why don't you go ahead and go?
Go ahead.
So let me first say I'm not a doctor, but I love being called Dr. Carlisle, so I might have to look into that.
We speak it on you. We speak it on you.
Speak it on me. So I would say it's all of our job. I think it starts off with just awareness. Having conversations like this one is so critical because you can't address what you don't know to exist. Being a part of this panel, even when I was preparing for it and thinking about it, I look at, there are minds across the country and across the world who are aware of and working to address this whole concept of intergenerational trauma, touching people who are directly impacted. I mean, we can't ask someone to address something that they don't even know exists. They may know their experiences. They may know, hey, life is tough, and my mom had it tough, and my great grandma had it tough, but I don't know why. So I think it comes down to us collectively as a community saying, awareness is the first step. Acceptance that, hey, this is real. And then advocacy. And I think that we're hitting all three of these points with this conversation. And then it has to go from there. So to me, this is opening the door. And I think that there are pockets of work going on, across the country and internationally. It's us coming together collectively to really push this movement forward. And so whose responsibility is it? I say it's all of ours, particularly those of us who are aware and informed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Dr. King, whose job is it to start breaking these intergenerational, or excuse me, intergenerational traumas? Whose job is it?
I would agree with Dr. Carla. We speak those things that be not as though they were. So there you go. Uh, but yeah, so I agree. Education is so crucial. That's why I really, really commend the city of Greensboro for taking an interest in mental health and doing a 5-part series. So when I did that as a commissioner, we did mental health and policing, mental health and education, how to navigate. We brought in vendors. A lot of people don't even know where to get help from.
Right.
So they could actually go to the tables and get pamphlets and know that this organization does this and this organization does that. Like you say, you have to first be aware of the fact and acknowledge the fact that you have it, but the resources in education and breaking the stigma. The biggest problem that we have is, especially in the Black community, is we don't want to talk about it. And I'm a Christian. I'm a chaplain. I'm a minister. We want to pray it away. It's not going to, God He can do all things, but we got to do something too. So to me, it's everybody's responsibility, including the federal government.
Thank you so much. Charlotte, tell me, whose job is it?
So on one hand, I think it's everybody's job as well, but I also am reflecting on if you're a traumatized person, to having that awareness of I'm traumatized and I need to heal is probably not going to happen. So I feel like it's whoever is capable of taking that on, of having that awareness and taking that on. But also when it comes to help, so I am a suicide survivor. I deal with mental health issues frequently, and there is a lot of help. There's very little help, and the help is within the context of white supremacy. So it's hard for me to take a diagnosis or an assessment from the people that made me crazy, right? The people who don't want to take account is that racism is traumatic, sexism is traumatic, right? So it's a product of my environment, but they want to tell me that it's me and that I need to get on this pill. So I can't trust that. And the trauma of the medical institutions, right? There's trauma there where they cut out our uteruses. They've done the Tuskegee experiment. So how can I trust you? How can I go to you when a lot of times I'm experiencing racism even in the appointments, right? Even in one of my appointments where I'm talking about the experience, racism I experienced on my job, they threatened to call security on me. You know what that is? That's traumatic. Okay. That's traumatic. So there's very little help and resources for Black people from like an African context. It's always in the context of white supremacy. And, typically when it comes to like hospitalizations, they love hospitalizing us. They love taking our kids away from us. They love finding ways to take our freedom away. I can't trust that as a Black woman. So I hear like white women saying, if you're having mental health issues, just hospitalize yourself. I'm not going to do that, right? Because I know that once you're in white power, it's a wrap, right? I've heard stories of women being held in the hospital and coming out with like a $40,000 bill because the white institutions would not release them. So I have a lot of compassion for our community because there aren't a lot of resources, and there's a lot of ways that we have accepted Black culture that is really Black consequence, right? It's a consequence of what we've endured, but we think it's our culture. It's not our culture. So I think that what's really important is for us, as far as healing it, is we need to examine it. Just like when I examined like what keeps Black women from taking time off, what keeps them from resting. Oh, that comes from this belief that if we rest, we're going to die. So as we look at that and we examine it, we can question: is that true? Is that if I rest, am I really going to die? And then we can practice working against that. Practice resting. Practice taking a break, even when you feel like it might kill you, to counter that trauma and to learn something different. So that's what I'm thinking, is that, we need to examine things and practice them. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Zoe, we're going to hear from you in just a moment. I just want us all to be aware that we do have a guest, and we're going to definitely, a guest just joined us on the panel, and we are going to introduce you as soon as we finish this round of questions. Okay. Zoe, can you tell me, when you think of whose job is it for intergenerational trauma to be broken?
When I think about it, I agree with what's been said. I think that the responsibility falls on the people who can recognize it. And I think that that's not always the person that's experiencing the trauma. Sometimes it's the people around them. I have friends that, they'll work themselves like to the bone, just nonstop, and never even consider resting. And for them, that's just a lifestyle. But for me, I'm like, that's a trauma response.
Right.
And, I might be the only person in their life that recognizes that. And so I feel like in that instance, it would be my responsibility. But I have, other situations where people might see me doing something and read it as a trauma response. And in those situations, I would think it would be their responsibility. And so I think it falls on the people around you that can recognize that you're experiencing trauma or having a trauma response to something, to really step in and show you the love and the compassion that you need to acknowledge that it's a trauma response and work through that trauma response.
Wow, absolutely. Dr. King.
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me. I was looking at your name, but I was actually trying to call on our president here. I'm so sorry about that. When you think of intergenerational trauma, whose job is it to go ahead and break that? Let us know.
Wow. So I know a sister was on. I don't know what happened. She's not with us now. Is that what happened? She's gone?
Yes. Sister is here with her. I wanted to give her a moment of her own to introduce herself and answer the question. I'm going to bring her on in just a minute.
All right. She's about who's to blame. We have to be clear about those are two different elements, right? So when we talk about the trauma in the cultural context of African people, we know that who's to blame for the situation have been white racist or white terroristic ideology, the process there that follows what they have done, and also who's responsible is those, as Chloe said, who recognizes it, who sees it as an issue. And I love the conversation about what can be a trauma response becomes normalized. We have to recognize also that there is a process, a problem, not only a social cultural problem. That is when we begin to see the environmental shifts and changes that take place, but there's a neurological problem that is also taking place. So when we see the high occurrence of ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer in the population, these are also responses or elements of trauma responses that have not been here. Am I losing everybody? Okay. The idea of wet nurses and so forth. So we have to deal with the issue that I'm trauma practices as well. So we have to identify for bringing ourselves into a space of health, healing, and holism. Those who know what has gone on, what has taken place, we can share more about that.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate you all. And as you had just talked about, we do have another wonderful guest as part of our panel. Sister, thank you so much for joining us. If you would just do us a favor and please go ahead, just introduce us, tell us your name, what you currently do, and where you're practicing out of. And I'll give you a chance to answer the question as well.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Sister Olorintoyin, Yoruba traditional, using Yoruba traditional practices in what I do. That is, I'm a psychosocial counselor based in Hamburg, Germany. And I'm working here also as a community organizer. I'm specially focused on migrant and refugee issues. And yes, this is basically what I'm doing. I'm also a founder of the Black Community Coalition for Justice and Self-Defense, which is advocating for
Sister?
justice in the sense of fighting for that
It's got a little bit choppy there.
our
And here's the world of
human
technology, right?
rights are acknowledged.
Technology, right? Give me just a second here, sister. It keeps on trying to cut you off. Can you hear me okay, sister?
Self-defense.
So Rose, we'll mute her for a moment, and then
Yeah.
we'll come back to her. Okay.
Sister, I don't know if you can
Go
hear
for it,
me or
Rose.
not, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mute your mic and I'm going to try to sync you back on, okay? And what I'll do is I'll give you an opportunity to answer the next question as we go on, okay? So if you can hear me, I'll kick you and then bring you back on in, okay? And we're just going to go ahead and we'll go right on along and have Sister go ahead and join us like she just did, okay? So let me go ahead and ask on to the next question. So now that you guys have already kind of shared with our audience how, what it is, how you guys see it kind of in your life, your daily work, whose job it is. We kind of get to the conversation of recognizing generational trauma, okay? Um, Generational trauma, of course, looks different from everybody because we all have different stories, right? But I want to present to the panel, if you can just tell us, how can a person pinpoint or recognize an intergenerational trauma pattern? What are some things or characteristics of a intergenerational trauma? Ms. Carla?
So I'm going to ask that we change up the order, if you
Okay.
don't mind. It would be
Absolutely.
helpful to me because as I'm listening to others, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. You know what I think we'll try to do really quick since we are just was having a little bit of technical difficulties. I'm going to go ahead and bring Sister back on and I'll let her go ahead and be the first one to answer. And then we'll go the other way so that this Carlisle is last for finally for this round of questions. Does that sound okay to everybody? Perfect. Okay, Sister, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so sorry that we were having issues, but the question was, oh, I think we may have lost her again, but that's okay. We're gonna go ahead and we'll start here with Dr. Washington. You want to go ahead and tell me how
So
it
one of the
is?
things,
Mhm.
one of the things that I thought that Zoe said that was very powerful was the idea of money. And we know that we have in the Black community this love hate relationship with money. So we say these biblical things of the love of money is the root of all evil that are very traumatic around economic development. That is an indication of trauma because we are afraid of wealth. We have passages that says that either you're in a storm, coming out of a storm, or just about to go into a storm. Those are dynamics of trauma. When we hear the languaging of stay woke, woke is past participle in the English language, which means if you want to say tell somebody to remain aware, you would say stay, be awakened, right? Be alert. But it's stay woke, which means again, it is a dynamic of trauma because we're saying that things have happened in the past, that happen right now, and they're going to happen in the future. So stay woke. When you hear the conversation utilizing the nomenclature of the oppressor, using the N word, the B word, the H word, right? The inhumane discourse, that is an indication of trauma, which is why we call it persistent enslavement, systemic trauma, ongoing issues. And so these are indices of trauma. When we see again the physiological challenges that we're having within our bodies as a people of African descent, how we are the most likely to die from the most preventable diseases or curable diseases, we know that that is another indices of trauma. So we have to know that it is an ongoing process and how to identify it. It is hard to tell a fish what water is. And that was also mentioned very early on, is that when we begin to normalize trauma, and so we begin to see the trauma response as a way of being, a way of life, that is problematic. But certain things that we do are trauma experiences. For example, and I'll close here by saying that when there's a high propensity to process hair to make it straight because there is bad hair, that is a trauma response. To bleach skin is a trauma response. To engage in code switching to sound intelligent is a trauma response. It's not the issue of not speaking intelligently. The issue is, why do we do these things? And again, these are ways of averting trauma in an environment that has been oppressive to our existence. What we name our children, we give them certain European names so that they don't incur trauma. That is a trauma response. And I think it was very mentioned early on by Stevens, which he said that when the system of education has failed a population, they then don't trust it. And so these are multiple levels of trauma that we are encountering that have become normalized. And so we identify with certain things. So we bleach skin and have good hair, and we go to education systems and we do these things. But all of these are elements of trauma that we have to address, and we could talk more about addressing those. Thank you.
Yes. Wow. You said some very, very profound things. I like how you mentioned different instances where it shows up in as a whole rather than just as one, specific incident. There's so many things that we do as a people that kind of hint toward that intergenerational. So thank you so much for that. Sister, thank you so much for joining us again. I'm sorry we were having technical issues, but nonetheless, we have your beautiful face back. We did go ahead and got a chance to hear most of your introduction. The question that we are in the process of answering now is, what are some symptoms or signs of intergenerational trauma?
Okay. Please, I have to excuse myself that I'm somewhere where the network is so bad. I'm on the road, but thank you all the same. The signs of trauma, I would say, is generally this disability within our communities. That is the well-being that we, after so many years of slavery and colonialization, we cannot say that our communities are thriving. Although we come, for example, from a continent with all the riches, yet we see that if you look at most African countries, they are still being labeled as underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Wow. That was very powerful. I wish that we can hear the end of it. We'll go ahead and see if she can go ahead and join us back if her connection gets a little better. If it doesn't, sister, thank you so much. Zoe, why don't you tell me, what do you think are some symptoms, or how can a person pinpoint?
In my opinion, the best way to be able to recognize these traumas and to actually be able to see them, outside of pursuing, the educational background to be able to see them, like, would be for somebody to, and it's kind of hard because it does go to means, but to break away from your normal patterns, from your normal neighborhoods, to have exposure to things that are a little bit different, regardless of not necessarily having to move across the country, but maybe even just going outside of your own neighborhood and being able to see the way that things function differently outside of your normal day to day. And I think that when you start analyzing and comparing things and realizing that, hey, the way it is for me isn't the way that it is for everybody. And then you start thinking about, why is that? What's happened differently in my life, or what's occurring differently in their life? And I think that when you start taking those analyzations and reflecting on those things, it can really kind of pinpoint where trauma may be occurring, and where, even in the history, because when you look at those things and you start looking at the timeline and you start looking at your family line, you may be able to pinpoint where things are happening generationally that you might not have been aware of prior to. You're muted.
We can't hear you,
My
Roscoe.
Yeah, there we go. Right. I love that, Zoe. You said something that really spoke to me when you said looking at your family lineage and kind of seeing those recurring patterns. Now, that's one of the things that they forced us to do when I was getting my undergrad. But I would strongly suggest that for anybody, if there are current things, or maybe, just kind of going back and just kind of looking at some of the things that maybe generations before you have struggled with. I really like that idea. Charlotte Stevens and the Ancestors, tell me.
So I agree with what Zoe just said about unhealthy patterns, right? So noticing those themes in your patterns. So, for example, domestic violence is a theme that is in my family. Absolutely around money. We have an unhealthy relationship with money. Hopefully, you can hear me okay. Are we good? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, unhealthy relationship with money, or just believing that money is the root of all evil, or just seeing how white folks have dealt with money, right? They sold us, they exploited us, and so feeling like, oh well, the way that they did it was evil, so associating money as evil, and money's not evil, y'all. Yeah, so our issues with our hair, colorism, so like the whole idea that light skin, light eyes is better, that's trauma. Being super harsh on our children is a trauma response, like whipping our children, or feeling like we have to protect them from the harsh realities. Child abandonment that happens in our community. I really feel like that the absenteeism of the Black man in our family is a trauma response, because they were often taken out of the family or couldn't protect their family. And so that trauma is still there. Single moms, I believe that that's a trauma response, because our families were ripped apart. Again, the man and the woman couldn't be together. Our homophobia, our transphobia, all those phobias, I believe is a trauma response. The way they say that if you're educated, you're talking white, that's a trauma response. The way that we over-sexualize, or we can sometimes over-sexualize ourselves, trauma response. Assimilation, and all the things we do to assimilate, all the things that we do where we're hyper-conscious of how we're being evaluated, and I'm not going to eat fried chicken in public, and I'm not going to blast my music, trauma response. Our obsession with depression. So I was really looking at LinkedIn and just how many of the Black women that I associate with, everything was about the way that the Supreme Court justice is being treated. And I get that that's relevant, but I feel that we don't need to indulge in things that make us feel terrible, right? Like, and the way that we kind of do that, the way that we're always just looking at how bad it is, I feel like it's a trauma response. And then the depression, anxiety, and rage that is within our community that is often untreated, misdiagnosed, or treated with vices. I believe all of that is also a trauma response. Thank you.
Absolutely. I love how you brought up what I don't think a lot of people talk about, is how becoming a single parent can be very traumatic, and how that can be intergenerational and a traumatic response. That's not something that I hear often when I have this conversation. So thank you for that. Dr. King.
Yes, I'm really enjoying this conversation. And Charlotte, you really touched on some things for me. So we know that racism, oppression, that's racial trauma. The effects of our kids being treated differently in schools, just even trying in housing, trying to get a house. I mean, I know some of you heard the story where there was a woman that tried to get a house and she couldn't get it, sent a white person, and the white person got the house. And I mean, all this stuff is trauma. And then when you look at George Floyd, how long did we watch that? That man, I mean, how with his knee on this man's neck, like, his life does not matter at all. even if we weren't there, we experienced trauma just watching that, because now we know that there's a good, strong possibility that that could be our son, our mother, our father, our sister, our brother. So trauma comes in so many forms. It just goes on, and it, you might not even realize it. I think that every African American went through trauma with George Floyd. So yeah.
For sure. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. King. I appreciate your thoughts. Dr. Carlisle, I can't stop saying it now. I
We're
can't.
going to claim that, the two master's degrees have to translate somehow. We're going to
There
get
we
to
go.
that, doctor. Okay. So I wanted to hear what the other panelists had to say, because I really value that we're all coming from different perspectives, but there are synergies there. So I just wanted to share. Zoe, you said something really profound that touched my heart, and so I'm going to get a little personal. And I had mentioned, becoming a foster parent and letting my license expire, and I tried for 6 years to co-parent with my son's birth parents, and that 6 years was the most humbling experience of my life. It goes to Dr. King mentioned faith. It's like, but for the grace of God go I. So while my family was not rich or anything like that, we had the fundamentals and the foundation of love. Living through and with a family that has extensive trauma just opened my eyes to so many things that I had not even honestly paid attention to before. So I just pulled up some stats that, I think most of us are familiar with, but I'll share it for the audience. Like people who experience extensive trauma are 2 times more likely to be smokers, 2 times more likely to suffer from depression, 3 times more likely to develop anxiety disorders, 7 times more likely to be alcoholic. Attempted suicide increases by 1,200%. And I want to sit with that for a minute and share with you that my son tried to die by suicide when he was 6 years old. And I'm sharing that with you, and it's obviously a highly personal thing, but we talk about stigma, we talk about prayer. I believe in prayer with works. For me, stigma is irrelevant when you're talking about a life. And when you're talking about the life of the child that you love and are responsible for. And so when I look at us as a community, we're responsible for each other. And I don't think that someone in the midst of trauma or who has suffered tremendously from intergenerational trauma, to Charlotte's point, can necessarily find their way. So for those of us who are now aware and have accepted and are advocating on behalf of the people who have experienced such trauma. And again, it happens from generation to generation, but that's why these conversations are so important. I also wanted to mention, that these adverse experiences, traumatic experiences, can cause developmental delays in children. As children are going through, and their brains are developing, if you think about, how you might feel if you're being chased by a bear, you're on 100, you're on 1,000. How do you think? How do you process? How do you learn in school? So the areas of impulse control and thinking typically are less developed in a child who is dealing with trauma than with the child that is not. And so we hear about kids like acting out in school or doing bad. It's frustrating not to be able to do what other people can do or other children can do, which seems very natural. But if you're on 1,000, how do you focus in on this assignment? How do you do that? And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that it costs a lot to our society as individuals, as Zoe mentioned, the financial aspect of it, but also just to our society, to our families, to our communities, and to our society. If we don't do better and get support for those of us who are experiencing intergenerational trauma or trauma in general. It's going to continue to cost us as a society. And I wanted to mention one last thing. I know I'm going more than a minute, but I wanted to share this because this is like my heart's
yes,
work,
go
right?
ahead, share with us, teach us.
So, for a child who is experiencing trauma, and I can tell you, once I got custody of my son, I thought, now what?
Right.
It was my responsibility to get trauma informed and to inform those who touch him, his teachers, the community. I work with law enforcement, helping them understand how to de-escalate a person in a mental health crisis, because prison and jail, that's not the answer. You know, I wrote down, before Dr. King said it, I wrote down George Floyd, because I said, if that wasn't like the obvious, I mean, we had Rodney King before that, but it didn't hit the same way. You know, if that's not obvious in terms of the trauma it costs. But I guess the last thing I wanted to say is that social buffers matter. So for a child experiencing trauma, having one loving advocate can mitigate so much of what happens to that child. And I'll just share with you on a personal note. It even goes as far as Charla mentioned, you get a diagnosis, a misdiagnosis. Look, in my son's psychological assessment, there was another child's name in his assessment. And I said, was this about Damien
You're
or
kidding.
about my kid? And she said, oh, no, it's still, she said, oh, it's still the same. No, it's not.
No,
the same.
absolutely
We're going to talk
not.
about my child. And when you say my child is going to have a limited future, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so as I pushed back, she said, well, if you keep doing what you're doing, the sky is the limit. If not, he'll do great with manual labor. And maybe that's what he chooses to do, but it will be a choice. And so I say this with passion for my child, but it's every child. Every Black and brown child deserves that loving advocate. And it's people like us who need to stand up and help stand in that gap for our children. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. No, that was profound. And I want to say thank you for feeling comfortable enough in this space to share such a personal story, because I think that a lot of times when we're speaking about intergenerational trauma, it can be easy to allude to things, but not really speak from the heart of vulnerability, which is where help and transformation mostly happens. So I thank you for that, for sharing that. Now, I want to get to the meat of this. And I want us to talk about how we address intergenerational trauma, right? But I want to break it up into a few different parts, okay? So I believe everyone has had a chance to answer that question as far as just seeing it, how it shows up. As we talk about addressing it, I want the panel to talk about how we address intergenerational trauma, starting in our families. Dr. Carlisle, you kind of mentioned to this already, but we'll go ahead and we'll keep the order as we had it before. Dr. Washington, I want to start with you on this one. In our families, at home, what are some ways we can address and possibly even break intergenerational trauma or intergenerational curses?
First of all, it's about acknowledging that the issue exists, that there are issues that we have inherited. There are things that we do with populations that we carry them to the Gambia, for example, go reconnect with the continent. We do African drumming as a form of healing. Identify the various rituals that you do within your family that reaffirm who you are. So a healing practice that we have within the community has been family reunions, whether we know it or not. And if you think about the dynamics of the Bantu Congo, said that we vibrate in 7 different directions and that we are threefold being, meaning that we are past, present, and future at the same time. And so we vibrate in 7 directions: leftward, rightward, forward, backwards, upwards, downward, and backwards. I mean, this idea of pre-paving the way is forward, sideways, left to deal with friends, right to deal with enemies. And so if you think about the dance that we do at the family reunion, the electric slide, it goes in those 7 directions. So in reality, we engage in ritual healing, but don't know that we're doing it. So it's also being able to unpack and uncover healing. When somebody says, how your mama and them in the South, how your mama and them is asking about how's your mother and the rest of them that are tied to her. Those are greetings of healing, because it's asking the question, how are things in your space? If I ask you in Yoruba, Shea Lafiani, I'm asking you, how are things in your universe? If I ask you about Sawubona in Zulu, I'm asking you, do you have a presence? So we hear most of our greetings are always about the communal aspect of being. We have to be able to analyze and assess those things. So when somebody says, mama's fine, but Ray Ray is out there again on that stuff, tell you, I'm bringing some greens over. What do the greens have to do with anything? The greens will actually be a part of the healing process, because as they are being prepared, there will be an incantation or spiritual renewal inside of that, which makes it SOUL, soul food for the soul, the uplift of the being. And so when they come into the space, these come into the space moments become ways of unifying and reaffirming and moving through trauma. So we have to also identify not only the things that have broken us up, but the things that have sustained us, because those things are also cultural in the context of the hell that we've encountered. Dr. Carlisle, who says she's not a doctor, is another example of the cultural healing process, that when you take in a child, that's been a common process, and then you begin to advocate for the essence of that child, not the issue of the expression, right, or where they've come from, but you advocate for the essence that in this child is something greater. So when the elders would say, and boy, I know you know better, that's the same thing that she did. It says, listen, the report says one thing, but I know in this child is something greater than what they have encountered. And so we have to recognize that these have been healing models that have been utilized. So we then elevate them and begin to move into spaces of reconnecting beyond this space. And I want to be clear about this, is that when we begin to identify with the oppressor in language and educational practices, within even our experiences, limited to just simply being in one space and not being global, we are re-traumatizing ourselves, which is why you see here in front of you names of Martha Kyrie as well as Kevin Washington, right? So I know my parents named me that because that was a name that they knew within the English vernacular. But also we know that we're bigger than this. There is no person of European descent that limits themselves to the continent of North America. They know that they're Serini, that they are Italian. They know if they are McDougall, that they are Irish and Scottish. So they can make those connections. In those connections are essential. So the form of therapy that we do is called Ubuntu psychotherapy out of South Africa, which talks about the idea of connectedness. And in closing, it goes back to what we said about being connected, is that when we know that we are tied to something greater than ourselves, it changes how we maneuver or move in the world. And so when Ubuntu says that your humanity is tied to my humanity, that we only be human together. The thing that we have done that has helped us sustain ourselves through trauma is that we said that, remember, when you're moving out in the world, you're representing all of us. And we know we say this because when we say that when somebody commits a crime, we say that, Lord, I hope he wasn't black, because if he's black, he's making us look bad. So the idea is that we have maintained some level of connectedness. And so with Ubuntu psychotherapy, talk about how to strengthen that connection in a positive way, to be able to extend the spirit and essence of what it means to be human. Because when we look at the expression of what we've encountered in North America, it has not been human or humane treatment. You can't lynch and castrate and violate somebody's physical well-being and deny them opportunities and say that you're human. Right. And so when I came up with the idea of Ubuntu, and also I said closing, but I really am closing here. Kufa Kwabantu means metaphysical illness of the people among the Zulu. And I asked the question, can Afrikaners, the oppressors, have these same disorders? There's a series of disorders that are there that are just powerful to acknowledge. It's like the DSM, but we find it in all African languages that these things are here. And so, it is called a Kufa Kwabantu, and so it is metaphysical illness of the people. And so I learned it from an Afrikaner who was studying the Zulu. And so I asked a closer woman who's tied to the Zulu in South Africa, can Afrikaners have these disorders like Abapanza bacillotella, which is the withdrawal of ancestral protection? And she said, no, you can't have these disorders if you're not human. Right. And so the issue was that you can't have certain disruptions in your psyche if you don't have what it means to be psychologically sound within a cultural context. And I suggest then that as we begin to maneuver, we assess with our own eyes, we assess with our own spirit and soul is human behavior. And this behavior that we've encountered is not human behavior. Thus, we don't have the same disorders, but also we don't have the same modality for healing and repair. Our job is to make sure that we solidly ground ourselves within the traditions, the rituals, the practices of our people to facilitate the sound healing of our soul, essence, and our being. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. You really schooled me on a lot of different things in terms of addressing and getting to, in our families, the intergenerational trauma. Zoe, tell me, when you think of, when we are talking about addressing intergenerational trauma, we're going to address three areas. In the family, how do you think are some ways, or what do you suggest some ways we can address that intergenerational trauma in our families?
I think it can be kind of difficult, in my opinion. I think that sometimes trying to have a conversation with family members about trauma that they've experienced or trauma that you may have experienced that they were a part of, it can become a very defensive conversation. People aren't always open to having the conversation. And a lot of times, even if it's not a conversation that's centered around blame, they'll feel like they're blaming them, you know? And so I think there can be a lot of difficulty around it, but I think that the more open people can be about having the conversation and, you know, waiting until someone is open to have the conversation. So not going into a conversation and feeling like I need to get this point across, I need you to hear what I'm saying, but being like, are you open to having this conversation? When can we have this conversation? I'd like to share this with you. I'd like to learn more about your experiences. And having it occur on more of an open platform, in my opinion, would be, in a family setting, a really constructive way to go about addressing trauma, because I think when it happens on an open platform, people are more open to sharing what's happened to them and understanding what's occurring in their life and how it affects the people around them.
So you made an excellent point. I just have a follow-up question for you, because you mentioned something that happens a lot in families, especially the families with people of color, when we try to address those backstories, or, you know, we talk about how those old families had all those secrets and all of these types of things, right? What would be your suggestion or piece of advice for a person? Let's say I go and I'm trying to break intergenerational trauma, and with my mother, we'll just say, mom, not really, we're just talking. But let's just say I go to her and she gets defensive with me. What would be your suggestion in that family setting of how a person should respond to that?
Um, and I think it's difficult, but I think that reinforcing the concept that you're coming from a place of love. I think that the more that you can reassure that person that you're not blaming them, that you're not angry with them, that you don't have animosity towards them, that you understand that they experienced something difficult, you know, coming to the conversation from a point of compassion and letting them feel that compassion, I think, in my experience, has gone a long way in terms of helping that person bring their walls down and bring their guard down. And I think it does take time. I don't think it always happens in one conversation, but I think the more compassion is brought to the table and expressed, the more people are willing to have difficult conversations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Zoe. Shala, tell me, in that family setting, what are some suggestions you have for kind of breaking those intergenerational traumas? Excuse me.
Piggybacking on what Zoe just said, I think that, so for example, I approached my father because I thought that he was abusive when I was a kid, and he got defensive. And that exchange was traumatic for me. So, and he never admitted anything. I never got that conversation. However, what I was able to do without him is forgive him, right? I don't have to engage in a conversation with you to forgive you. I can forgive you on my own. And I think that doing that forgiveness work before you have the conversation will help you to not have that defensive air of, I need something from you. I've already restored myself. I don't need anything from you. If you never say anything, never apologize, I'm still good. So I want to hold that. We don't need the other person to take responsibility. That'd be nice, but traumatized people often can't do that. And then another way that you can get traumatized people to kind of recognize their trauma is by showing them how they were traumatized. So when I would teach about sexism in my classroom, I didn't start with a video about sexism, about men, this is what you do to women. I started with a video called The Mask You Live In, which teaches how boys have been conditioned to be homophobic. They've been conditioned to be sexist. And so when I started there, about you were traumatized first, and then you were taught to be a traumatizer or a terrorist or whatever, sexist, homophobic, all of that. Now everybody's engaged because the boys feel like, okay, there's validation for what I went through. So a lot of people who practice who do traumatic things were traumatized, and it's hard for them to hear what you have to say because their pain's not being acknowledged, right? And I think that our lack of compassion that we have in our community for other Black people is a trauma response. But a lot of times we're like, why can't Black people get it together? Why can't we do this? Instead of like, we are constantly traumatized. There isn't a lot of healing for us. So we need to have that compassion, knowing that we're doing the best we can, even if our best isn't great. And when it comes to the family, I think about mom. I mean, the reason why I switched from doing I focus on anti-racism work. Now I'm focusing on Black women. When it comes to the family, that's typically a Black woman who's holding that down. And in the context of conversations around women, white people are centered. In the conversation about racism, Black men are centered. And so where's the Black woman in that conversation? So I feel like for me, when I was practicing some of my unhealthy behaviors with my kids, it was when I was super stressed out, when I was working, I was commuting 25 hours, working over 40 plus hours, not making enough money. So having my own business, being in charge of my money, making good money, working with people I want to work with, being in charge of my time, that significantly impacts my mental health. That significantly impacts how I show up for my children, which is why I teach entrepreneurship to Black women. Like we should not have to be enduring all that abuse and toxicity. Of course, we're going to come home and that's going to affect our children. Where else would that go, right? So really getting Black women to deeply self-love themselves, to prioritize their self-care, not self-care Saturday, but self-care every day. And one of my mottos is self-care or die, because we're dying. And if we don't prioritize self-care, it's a wrap. So self-care every day, self-love every day. And then what Dr. Mulasa, I hope I said your name right, was saying about connectivity. So teaching Black women about their Black girl magic, and that your melanin connects you to the cosmos. Your melanin connects you to ancestral intelligence. Your melanin helps repair your cells and fights infection. Your curly hair has the golden spiral in it. Connectivity of, I'm connected to all things. I'm connected to the cosmos. I'm connected to the ancestors. I'm connected to the spirit world. Then I don't feel assaulted. I don't feel alone. Everywhere I go, I got 4,000 ancestors rolling with me. That's how I feel. Like everywhere I go, I'm protected. So getting us back in touch with our divinity, getting us back in touch with our connection is going to help us erase some of that. And again, I can't stress it enough, being in charge of your money. The queens that I talk to and I work with, I still feel like we're enslaved in the sense that we're scared about what we post online. We're scared about what shirts we wear. We're scared about how we show up in the world because we're scared that the white powers that be are going to punish us and then we're going to die on the street. Versus if you have your own business and you can run your own stuff, you're not fazed by that. If y'all see me online, I wild out. I posted a bikini picture on LinkedIn, and I did that to show that, like, F these LinkedIn police. Do what the heck you want to do. Live your life. You can still get paid, right? You can show up unapologetically as yourself and still get paid. But so many of us feel like we have to assimilate. We have to show up some type of way. We're dying inside, trying to get people to pick us and validate us. We need to have that self-love, knowing that we have these magical powers, knowing that we have the connections. We're already chosen. I'm the original woman. I'm the original goddess. I'm already chosen. God validated me. I don't need validation from anybody else. God validated me. So when we feel that sense of connection, we ain't gonna be worried about what everybody else got to say. So there you go.
Yes, Charlotte. Thank
you. All that.
Yes, you have said a mouthful. Yes, and I just love you hit on so many different things, but particularly with the family, the two things, everything you said stood out to me, and I'm going to think about it all night. But I really like how you talked about the forgiveness piece that's being important in intergenerational trauma, addressing that in the family light. And then you also talked about realizing and recognizing that when we go to try to break these traumatic things in our family lines, that we're dealing with traumatized people. And so that's something to definitely keep in mind. I love that you said that. I love everything you said because I'm connected to the cosmos. I love that. Dr. King, can you tell me? I know
I am loving this. So I don't know if you all know that I am the CEO and founder of Black Women Empowered, and we have millions of followers on Facebook. Actually over 3 million on Facebook, and we're everywhere. So we're in our 10-year anniversary, and I'm going somewhere with this. We've been empowering Black women to believe in themselves for 10 years. And so one of the things that really gets me, and this just recently happened. I published my first book of poetry, and a lot of it has to do with racism and how we're treated. As one of the poems is called "Oh to Be Black," but I posted it on LinkedIn, and a white woman says, "Well, I'm all for it, but I just don't know why it has to be black." Well, I usually am not confrontational, but boy, and you can go to my page, it's pinned to my page, and you can read it, because I pinned it just so everybody could come in there and see it. And she said, no, she said, I don't get it. And I said, what about it don't you get? Well, some of my best friends are black. Oh, here we go. I mean, it just goes on and on. We have got to love ourselves. We have got, regardless to what anybody else thinks, be bold, be brazen. Forget what they think. It doesn't matter. You are a queen. You are a king, and can't nobody take that from you. So to me, it's reinforcing who you are, whose you are, and who you are in Christ. If you're a believer, God has given you the power to go forward. You don't need anybody's permission. You can do this. That's what I love about, just reinforce, getting up every day, tell you, look, I don't care what comes before me, I got this. I'm going forward. I'm going to be positive. I'm not letting negative thoughts come into my head, and reinforcing that with your children. One of the things about Black Women Power, we did a documentary. I hope you guys will go check it out on autism. It's called Gray is a Color. It's on YouTube. And 3 mothers had autistic kids. Can you imagine the trauma that a mother that finds out that their child is autistic, especially if they're nonverbal?
Yes.
But even if they're verbal, all the stuff that they're going to have to endure, and the child is going to have to endure, because they're going to be, if they're in regular school, they're probably going to be bullied. And you'll see this one mother, she was a PhD. Her son, he was bullied. He has his own business now. All 3 of them talk about their different experiences and how they stuck together as a family. They empowered their girls and boys, that this is not something that's going to hinder you from your greatness. So to me, we have to reinforce in our kids and our family, our children, our siblings, don't drown out the noise. Okay? You have to drown out the noise and believe in yourself. And to me, that's one of the greatest ways that you can get past this. And also, I believe in therapy. We also have Dr. Nikisha Hammond, who is a psychologist. She comes on every Tuesday on our LinkedIn and on our Facebook page and does mental health moments. She's been doing this for 4 years. They love her. She gives tips on how to get through different situations. She didn't get paid for this. She does this because this is her reasonable service. And she's been in Ebony and Essence and MSNBC and all of that. But that's what I think that we just have to really work at encouraging each other, encouraging ourselves, and believing in ourselves, and getting help when you have to. There are Black psychologists. You don't have to go to a white. There are plenty of them. If that's an issue for you, but by all means, don't let it defeat you.
That's right. Thank you so much, Dr. King.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No, what were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say thank you for the space.
Yes, and I love how you said something profound to me when you said that the children, everything you said was great. That stuck out to me though, because I think that a lot of times in that intergenerational trauma, children can get lost in that because we're healing, we're traumatized, right? So I think I love how you specified that and making it intentional about speaking life into our children. I really, really love that. Dr. Carlisle, tell me.
Oh my goodness. So much great insight. Let me try to add a little bit here. So I'll go back to my 3 statements: awareness, acceptance, and advocacy. When I start with awareness, Dr. Washington, I don't have his name in front of me, his African name in front of me. He talked about, who we come from. And I'll tell you, I have 2 older sons who went to Africa, to Ghana, with an organization here called the Male's Place. And every day I got pictures of them with men adorned in gold, with, they learned some real basic skills in Ghana. They planted a garden. They went to the caves where the slave skulls were located. They got an education that you just can't learn in books. They saw that we are from kings and queens. They saw that. I was touched by the photos. I can't imagine, like, that's on my to-do list is to go and see. I think also Zoe and mentioned about talking to family members, like, and there was conversation around breaking barriers. I think it's important, and I think Charla mentioned this, is to acknowledge someone's pain. Acknowledge, that there was hurt and pain. And I'll tell you, with my son's birth mom, she called me white girl for the first 2 years she knew me. And I was highly offended, but it took me time to understand why she referred to me that way. It took me time to understand how, when we partnered together, from her lens, my son was overeducated. He wasn't overeducated, but if you come from an environment where you hear you're not going to amount to anything, you're not going to be anything, you're not going to do anything. Yeah, this kid seems overeducated, but he's not overeducated. In fact, this is what progress looks like to me, to hear, and I'm getting personal again, my son's birth mom say, I want him to do better. And in my mind, I'm thinking, we know it takes a village to raise a child. We want our child to do better, but not everybody had that experience growing up. Not everybody had the experience of, I want my child to excel in whatever way they want to beyond where I am. And so recognizing that, so I think understanding the context and introducing openness, like, let's get rid of these shackles of what we can and cannot do. It's very simple for me to say because of my experiences. It's not as simple for someone who has never had that kind of support or understanding in an authentic way to just say, oh, I'm getting rid of all of my shackles and I know I can do anything. It's not that simple. And so Dr. King mentioned, whether it's therapy, it's your spiritual beliefs, whatever that is, and the support that's available, I think is so critical. And accepting that, we've had trouble, we've had pain, we've had violence, we've had hurt in our family, but we want better for our children. And I will tell you one way that I'm instilling that in my son, and I'm going to do a merciless plug here. My son and I just released this book. It's called My Big Notebook. And it's his way of helping other children with affirmations, with coping mechanisms, with how to feel good about self, with journaling, writing down how I feel, and coloring pictures. How do I get from this feeling to this feeling? And learning about, like, the cognitive triangle of thoughts, feelings, and actions in a way a child can understand. So he is learning how to help himself and at the same time help other children. And I think really, it's cliche to say children are our future, but really we can affect change, but the real change is going to happen with our kids and what we do. That's my belief. And I think if we continue to advocate and take it up a notch for our children through this awareness and through, helping them understand, what they are capable of, which is unlimited. It is literally limitless if we give them that support. And I had a couple other things to say, but I'm gonna leave it at that. But the last thing I wanted to say is we've talked a little bit about money around money and trauma, and what I will say is that trauma is expensive. not just money wise, emotionally, physically, in every way. When I got through like our 10-year process, I was 40 pounds overweight, pre-diabetic, financially depleted, isolated. All of these things can happen without us even realizing it. So being intentional about it. And then if you get through and you're in a stable state, what do we do from there? And I'm telling you, honestly, I had over $100,000 worth of debt tied to my trauma that I pushed over there because I didn't want to deal with it. But I had to connect with someone who could help me address it. I'm happy to say that all that debt is gone, but yay, but I'm one person. So it's me sharing those stories with the next person, and so on and so forth. We can help each other get to a healthier place. So I speak from a place of lived experience for myself and my son and those who have not found their voice to speak yet.
Absolutely. Dr. Carlisle, thank you so much for that insightful response. I feel like you addressed a lot of different things in terms of what we can do as far as action steps, and I really appreciate that. That kind of leads me into our question as we go ahead and get ready to wrap up the panel. I have a question to present to all of you. A person is listening to this. They have defined intergenerational trauma. They have kind of looked at where it shows up in their life. I present to the panel, what is one thing that a person can do starting today or tomorrow or whatever? What's one tangible thing that a person can do to begin to break intergenerational trauma in their life? Zoe, we'll go ahead and start with you, and we'll work our way down. And Dr. Washington, you'll actually be the last one after Dr. Carlisle this time.
Wow, there's that's a really good question. I mean, I think somebody who's aware that they could have these traumas and wants to start taking a look at ways to move through them. There are several things you can do. I think on a personal level, maybe one of the first steps and one of the things that you can do is actually sit down and, whether it's like a journal or a notepad, but actually write out what you believe your trauma is. And once you have a list of what you think the trauma is or what you're experiencing, I think that might make it easier to seek avenues in which you can find help, whether it's therapy or groups, or even things as simple as, being able to go out and exercise more, do more things for yourself, separate yourself from certain situations. But I think starting with actually writing it down and acknowledging these traumas is the first place to start that process.
Excellent. Thank you, Zoe. I appreciate that. Charlotte, tell me, what's one thing that a person watching this could do to begin to break that intergenerational trauma in their lives?
The first thing I would say to do is, sorry about that noise, is spend a lot of time with self-love. Because a lot of times when we experience trauma, when we experience abuse, we feel shamed. We feel bad instead of the person who did it, feeling bad. So the first thing is I say, you identify that, pour a lot of love into yourself. You probably don't feel good. Journaling is great. Get a lot of that stuff out on writing, practice forgiveness. So there's a mantra on the internet, which is, please forgive me, I forgive you, I love you, thank you, I'm sorry, right? So I practice self-forgiveness first, because sometimes if we've been traumatized, we can be mad at ourselves for exposing ourselves to trauma. So maybe just, practicing self-forgiveness. Being in nature is really healing. Giving your woes to nature, whether you could give your energy to the earth by putting like your feet in the earth, putting your hands in the earth, but allowing that energy to kind of dissipate from you and go into Mother Earth. Writing things down and then burning them. So whatever you want to release, writing it down, especially on a full moon, and burning that, releasing that. There's meditations that can help you move through trauma. So meditation is actually really good too, because it helps you to, regulate and center yourself. Dancing, but a lot of self-care, because generally, if you've experienced trauma, you are traumatized, and you need and you can't. You want to operate from the most healed place possible, especially if you're going to be confronting anybody. So again, I think a lot of it is just that self-work, working on yourself, and then getting the help that you can find help, especially that's centered in African culture and not just our mental health institutions need to be decolonized. They need to be better able to serve Black and Brown people. But also, I would really love our mental health institutions to not be connected to white power, because I don't trust anything connected to white power. So for me, if I'm going to go seek help and you tell me that at the end of the day you answer to some white person or some white authority, I don't trust that. So I think that that's another thing that we need, is we need more resources in the mental health department, because when you're looking for that outside help, sometimes that help is also re-traumatizing. And the last thing I would say is really just be mindful about what you bring into your home, because a lot of times, again, like I've never seen George Floyd murder, right? Why would I watch that? Why would I participate in that? Why, in the way that people were like trauma watching it over and over and over again. Why do that to yourself? Like, I feel like that's a trauma response, where we're just so used to like just being in pain that we just look at things that are painful all the time. So being really mindful about, are you watching the news? Are you watching things that bring you down? Like, don't watch that. Like, I didn't watch the woman being that like I said, the Supreme Court justice and all of the abuse she was enduring. I was watching, Is It Cake, which is a show about, making realistic objects look like a cake, because I need that attention out, right? Like, as a Black woman, I already endure all of the isms. I need to make sure I'm well and not constantly think that I have to fight or be in the horror of it all the time. So that's another thing I would say, is don't re-traumatize yourself, protect your peace, cut people off if you have to, do what you have to do to be well, because just like Dr. Carlisle said, is that trauma is expensive. Like it is expensive. I almost lost my life last December because of suicide, right? And it's like, I'm a resource. I'm a gem. I know my worth. I know that like the world needs me, but I could have been gone because of the trauma that I've endured, and because there's such a lack of help available. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Charlotte. I really appreciate it. Dr. King, what's a step that a person can take starting today to maybe start breaking some of that intergenerational trauma?
Well, the first thing that I think everyone has said is acknowledging that that you have it. Because if you don't acknowledge it, then you'll never be able to deal with it. I think that just positivity, like I said, if you have a spiritual connection, prayer, meditation, of course, I told you before, I do believe in therapy when it's necessary. One of our ministers on our platform said last night, we actually had a program last night, and he has a therapist that comes into the church I think a 1 month, one Sunday a month on Sunday. And to me, that's amazing, because a lot of the churches want to act like it doesn't exist, and so when we start taking things into our own hand and taking care of us, that's a major step, because a lot of pastors want to think they have all the answers. They want you to think that they know everything, and so yeah, let our men and women of the cloth be responsible. Give back to your parishioners. Help them get through it, because they're in the church, and even pastors are some of the biggest ones that experience it. They're dealing with death and counseling and this and that. Just acknowledge that you have a issue, and take time to address it. Whatever that means to you, it's different for everybody. If you need to take a long ride, and just look at some scenery. I like to ride, and look at those wind towers in Indiana. Doctor she knows about what I'm saying. It's like 5 miles of wind towers, and I just, every time I see them, I get excited because it's pretty cool. But whatever it is that works for you, that's what you do. If it's like sitting in a room with nothing on and just meditating, just take care of you.
I love, love, love the idea that your church has mental health incorporated. And I just think that that is so profound. You had mentioned earlier how, there comes a point in time we can pray and have faith. And you mentioned you're a believer. I am too. And there's it's great to pray and have faith in all of that. But there comes a point in time when the responsibility is yours. And I think that's where the mental health piece steps in, and actually seeking that. So kudos to you guys for that. I've never heard that before. I've heard people talk about it, but I just think that is wonderful. Dr. Carlisle, I can't unsay it now. Tell me, what's an
We're claiming that.
Yes.
So I think, everything that's been said on the panel is very relevant. I'll just share from a self-care perspective. I follow this, I put together this four-step method. It's called the BEST method. And it starts off with breathing. Like, we just breathe deeply to reset our brains, to reconnect, to refresh. And then the E is for empathy. I think we are oftentimes our own worst critics. We can be so hard on ourselves, and we really should show ourselves some grace. Like, there was conversation before, Charlotte mentioned forgiveness. We have to forgive ourselves too. Like, no one is perfect. We all make mistakes. I mean, but we have to just give ourselves some grace. And then the S is for support, like stand up your support system. My support system from 10 years ago is very different from what it is today. Needs change. And not everyone knows who to go to for support. So I agree, whether it's therapy, meditation, whatever that looks like, exercise for you, build up that support system. And it's not just one person, and it's not just one thing. And I think the last part of it, the T in BEST, is trust. And that's, trusting yourself and your higher power, and also recognizing who broke your trust, who broke our trust, and understanding that, forgiving for ourselves, and then saying like, hey, I trust myself, and what I don't have, I will seek out to move forward. And so that is the 4-step BEST method. And I believe that that is really a path to help us handle and manage beyond trauma. I think healing is an action. It's not a one and done. We are forever in the state of healing, and it's about progress, not perfection.
Absolutely. You said a mouthful. I relate to so many different things that you said. And I love how you gave those acronyms as actionable steps, because that's what helps me. I need actual things that I need to do. So I love that acronym. And I also love how you talked about forgiveness and healing being a process. A lot of people think that it's just a choice that you make. And it's not like that at all. So thank you for putting that emphasis on that. And I think that that is a great method to get started with in breaking those intergenerational traumas. Excuse me. Hey, Dr. Washington, tell us, what are some actionable steps that people can take listening to this live panel here today to start breaking those intergenerational traumas?
I like the word that you slipped on was generosity. You say intergenerosity. That's a powerful word. Even though you didn't mean to say that, that word is powerful. To the idea of generosity, be generous to oneself. I think that is critical. I was going to say something else, but that speaks volumes about being generous. I want to say that when I mentioned earlier about it being a neurological process, to recognize that dopamine is implicated in the process of trauma. Dopamine allows us to be able to block pain, to feel good. Also, endorphins are implicated in the process. People who have gone through a great deal of trauma have depleted sources of dopamine, which means then they try to ingest it. So what was mentioned earlier by Dr. Carlisle, and I'll pause it just for a moment. Dr. Carlisle, the presence or the title is granted to those who are fit, not because you've gone through a particular academic process, but because life has given you a set of training, a series of events that allows us to be able to acknowledge your expertise in an area that supersedes what any academy can give you. I just want to go back. I want to make sure that we acknowledge that.
Amen.
But
I receive that. May I say
Okay.
that? I receive it.
And so we want to recognize that when dopamine is depleted, then we find alternative ways of trying to ingest it. And so you mentioned to us this idea of cigarette smoking, right? We mentioned we could talk about substance abuse. There's a high occurrence of substance abuse. And when they trying to find ways to ingest or to stimulate dopamine within the bloodstream, within the system. When these don't tend to work very well, people tend to become homicidal and suicidal. And so you mentioned earlier, Charlotte, about suicidal ideations. These things are real because we then begin to lose pleasure in life. So this conversation about trauma is significant, and I want to make sure that we know that it's not simply a social, cultural, environmental phenomenon, but it is a neurobiological issue that's taking place, and we have to be able to reset that. And so when Zoe said exercise is one of those things, or was mentioned about being in nature, those things reset the system. Or to, as you said, Carla, the first thing is to breathe. You're resetting the system to self-regulate, to be able to increase endorphins and dopamine, to be able to put things back into perspective again. So exercise is one thing that burns off the adrenaline that causes part of the depletion of dopamine. And so when you burn it off, you begin to increase the likelihood of serotonin being more in the bloodstream, which enhances your sleep regulation. So all these things are happening. So all these things have been mentioned in our conversations. And we have to know that it is a total body experience. We often reduce it to a psychological one or a psycho-spiritual one. We know that the reason that we have the shout in the church, the dance, is because of it, that it is a response to trauma, but also it is a release of certain neurochemicals that have been built up within the body. And so there's a healing that takes place. And then there's the covering that comes when people begin to surround and to pray for, because we know that there's another dimension of what's called psychoneuroimmunology, the idea of the psychological process of repair and healing that goes on in the context of disruption to this body, mind, and soul. And so what I would submit then is the one step to take is to focus on the victories that you have in your life, because what you begin to focus on tends to grow. And too often we turn our direction towards the things that we have failed at. There was an example of this is when I was learning to ride a bike with no training wheels, and there was a sidewalk, and to the left there was a grass, there was a sidewalk in front of me, and a man to the left, the right of me. And I kept saying in my head as a child, as a 5-year-old, don't hit the man. I had all the grass to the left, I had a sidewalk in front of me, and only a small space where the man was standing. And we know what happened because I focused on it. I directed my bike right into him and crashed into him and the leaves that he was raking. And the point is that when we begin to acknowledge what we focus on, knows that whatever we focus on will tend to grow. And so we focus on our victories and know that the mind is like a garden. Whatever we plant there, things will grow. So everybody in this room, everybody on this chat, everybody that's been a part of this particular viewing who will see this, have encountered a series of victories in their lives, things that they have overcome that no one thought they could ever get through. Those things we have to look at and see, now, how did I make it through? Because if I got through that one, I can get through the next one. And so it's critical then to focus on the victories. It's not diminishing, Charlotte, anything about the trauma and its impact, because the traumas are real. Rape, molestation, being denied. It's not belittling or demeaning that. When we talk about a childhood trauma, my father used to comb my hair and used to sing, your hair is nappy, who's your pappy? You some ugly child. So that was a traumatic conversation. But the question I asked is, who told him that? And who told him that? And so that was passed on. But the reality is that I am here. That victory is that we overcame the ideas that he was using some form of humor. So I have to dig past that. And you said forgive. Forgive means to move beyond for. And for means I move beyond giving it power over me. That's the issue. It doesn't mean to forget. It means to forgive its hold on me. Right. And so I can forgive. I can release that. And that's what you said so eloquently. I can release all that and to move into the power of being. So my statement is to always acknowledge in all things the victories that you have encountered, because if it happened yesterday, and if it happened today, and if it happened to Carla, and if it happened to Dr. King, if it happened to Charlotte, if it happened to Zoe, if it happened to Rose, it got to be able to happen to me. And so we have to be able to acknowledge the victories, because then we build upon those and they become forms of I'm saying toxicity, but that's not the word. They become contagious. That's the word I'm looking for. So the victories become contagious, and then more of them will grow, and we become stronger against any oppressor. And the greatest oppressor that we have is ourselves, our own mind. Stephen Biko says that the greatest weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so when we free our minds, as Paul Funkadelic says, when we free our mind, our behinds will follow. And so we recognize then that we begin with acknowledging the victories. And so, Rose, I am quitting. I'm done. This was exciting. I didn't know how I was going to pause into a day of things that I had planned to do for the day and things I have to do later on tonight. But I will suggest that this was a moment of healing and repair for me. I thank all of you for sharing deeply from the heart, the spirit, and the soul, because I have been uplifted to be able to move through, and no one knows the things that I'm even going through right now. And we don't know what anybody's going through, but this moment of healing. And my mother always says that you can never help someone out without helping yourself in the process. And so this act today of sharing has been healing and repairing and restorative for me as I go through certain things. And so I encourage you all to continue to uplift yourselves and others, because you all are the medicine that we seek in the world. Thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to take a moment to say to everybody on this panel, I interview I host, and this is what I do. And I don't think that I've ever had a panel interview full of such brilliant, authentic, open, creative, thought-provoking minds. And I am not blowing smoke. This is probably maybe my fourth panel interview that I've done. I guess if it's more than two people, but still, in this size. And I am honored. I will open up the floor if you have any last thoughts, anything you want to say. Zoe, we'll go ahead and start with you. And just thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here today. Zoe, any last words?
No, I would also just like to say thank you. This was a very stimulating conversation, and I think it brought up a lot of techniques and a lot of hard conversation. And I think that the people that were listening to this will be able to pull a lot from it. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for allowing me to be a part of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zoe. I appreciate that. Charlotte, tell me, any last words?
I just want to again say thank you. I think this is a really important panel. I also want to encourage Black women to join my Self-Love for Badass Black Women challenge I'm having on an Eventbrite. You can also follow me on LinkedIn if you're interested in getting some coaching on how to start your own business or work on your self-love or get in touch with your Black girl magic, all of that. I'm here for you, so reach out. And thank you again for allowing me to be here with all these brilliant minds. And Dr. Carlisle, I'm going to call her out before she says it. She is a TEDx speaker, I think 2 times. So I'm going to make sure that she tells us about that by calling her out now. Bye.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I appreciate that. Dr. King, any last words while you're with us today?
Yeah, this has been really a pleasure sharing and hearing from the queens and the kings. I have definitely been encouraged. And I think that I think I've connected with some of you on LinkedIn. I'm not really sure, but if not, please follow me on LinkedIn. We need to have more conversations like this. This is how we're going to heal. This is how we're going to help each other. This is what BWE does. If you don't follow us, Black Women Empowered, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Pinterest, we're on TikTok, we're on Twitter, and of course we're on LinkedIn. So you can get 24/7 inspiration and encouragement. Please follow us, and thank you all. I love you. My favorite saying, my team knows I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I hope we can do this again. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Carlisle, take it away for us. What you got to say, doctor?
Well, as an esteemed doctor, no, I'm just kidding. No, I would just like to say, again, it's really been my pleasure and honor to be a part of this panel. As Charlotte mentioned, I am a TEDx speaker. My TEDx talk is called Becoming Trauma Informed Changed My Life. And when I tell you it did, becoming trauma informed really did change my life. And just being able to connect with such positive, insightful visionaries. I will say, I think all of us look for a time when these generational, what we used to call curses, the generational trauma is broken for each and every one of our families. And I think this is a good step in that direction. Having actionable items that we can all work on and toward and spread the word is very impactful. And so I encourage everyone, please connect with me on LinkedIn and Instagram, Carla A. Carlisle. And I just want to say really quickly, I shared with you all, my big notebook by my son and me. And we're actually doing a book launch in Charlotte, North Carolina on National Children's Mental Health Awareness Day. May 7th at Studio 229 on Brevard. And we're benefiting some charities that support children. And, we have kids who are 4, 5, 6, 7 years old in psychiatric residential treatment facilities. Many of them are foster children, some are not. We have a lot of work to do. And this is a great step in that direction. So thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. It was certainly a pleasure to have all of you here with us. I am just so informed. If you guys could stick around after we end the broadcast, that would be great. For those of you that are watching, thank you so much. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you decided to be here with us. Black Mental Health Matters is coming at you Saturdays. Do not forget, every Saturday, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. And also, African History Month is not done. We still have a few more days, so don't forget to tune in to us, every Saturday with that as well. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you.